Imagine waking one morning to discover you've been chosen by the gods themselves, not for punishment, but for honor, the highest honor your civilization can bestow. You are given a palace to live in, the finest clothes woven from cotton and adorned with feathers, servants to attend your every need. You will feast on delicacies reserved for nobility. You will be treated quite literally as a living god, walking among mortals. There's only one condition. In exactly 1 year, you will climb the steps of the Great Pyramid. Priests will bend you backward over a stone altar, and while your heart still beats in your chest, they will cut it out with an obsidian blade and hold it, steaming and pulsing, toward the sun. This was the reality for the Ixiptla, the chosen ones of the Aztec Empire. These were not criminals or prisoners of war, though many sacrifice victims were. These were carefully selected individuals, often young and beautiful, who would spend their final year on earth embodying a deity. They were worship-made flesh, living idols who walked the streets of Tenochtitlan, knowing precisely when and how they would die. Today, we're going to follow one such person through their final year. We'll experience the psychological labyrinth of living as a god with a death sentence. We'll witness the crushing weight of predetermined fate wrapped in golden finery. And we'll explore why the Aztec state orchestrated this theater of divine terror with such meticulous care. Because this wasn't just religious devotion, it was something far more calculated. The selection process began long before you knew your fate. Aztec priests and officials searched throughout the empire for the perfect Ixiptla to embody Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, one of the most powerful and capricious gods in the pantheon. They sought someone young, usually in their late teens or early 20s. Physical perfection was essential: unblemished skin, symmetrical features, the right height and build. Any visible scar or deformity would disqualify a candidate immediately. But physical beauty wasn't enough. The ideal Ixiptla possessed grace, intelligence, and the ability to learn quickly. They needed to master the sacred flute, to dance the intricate ritual dances, to carry themselves with divine bearing. Some sources suggest that many Ixiptla were actually the sons of nobles or even foreign princes captured in war, individuals already trained in courtly behavior and educated in the arts. When the priests arrived at your home, your family would have experienced a collision of emotions impossible for us to fully comprehend: terror and pride, grief and honor. In Aztec society, this selection elevated your entire lineage. Your family gained social status, material benefits, and the eternal glory of having provided a living vessel for the divine. Yet they also knew they were watching you walk toward certain death. They would have 1 year to reconcile these opposing truths. The transformation began immediately. You were taken to the temple complex, bathed in sacred water, and dressed in the regalia of Tezcatlipoca. Black body paint covered your skin, the god's signature color. Shells and bells were attached to your ankles so that your every step announced your presence. Gold jewelry adorned your arms, your neck, your ears. A crown of feathers was placed on your head. You looked in the polished obsidian mirror, the smoking mirror itself, and saw not your own face, but the god staring back. For the next year, you would live in a state of surreal contradiction. You inhabited the most beautiful palaces in Tenochtitlan. 8 attendants followed you everywhere, catering to your every desire. The finest foods were prepared for you: turkey, fish, chocolate, fruits that common people rarely tasted. When you walked through the markets and plazas, people bowed, they brought offerings, they prayed to you. Children were taught to revere you, you were worshipped. Yet you were also a prisoner. Those attendants were also guards. Your every movement was choreographed, your days structured around ritual obligations. You learned the sacred songs, practiced the ceremonial dances, mastered the art of playing the clay flutes, whose haunting melodies would accompany your final procession. You were being prepared, groomed, rehearsed for a performance that would end with your death. The psychological dimension of this existence defies easy categorization. Some scholars suggest the Ixiptla may have been given psychoactive substances, perhaps psilocybin mushrooms or other sacred plants, to ease the psychological burden and induce states of spiritual transcendence. Others propose that the year-long immersion in ritual and reverence created a kind of dissociative acceptance, that the constant reinforcement of divine identity might have actually convinced some victims they truly were gods, and their death a necessary cosmic act rather than murder. The year unfolded in carefully orchestrated phases, each designed to deepen your transformation from human to divine vessel. The early months were almost dreamlike in their luxury. You woke in rooms filled with light streaming through carved stone windows, the air perfumed with copal incense that burned continuously in braziers throughout the palace. Servants brought you breakfast, tamales filled with turkey and peppers, cups of chocolate whisked to a froth and flavored with vanilla. The chocolate was thick and bitter, reserved for nobility and warriors, and you drank it knowing that each sip was a privilege denied to nearly everyone in the empire. Your days followed a rhythm that was simultaneously indulgent and rigorously controlled. Morning hours were devoted to learning the sacred flute. The instrument was deceptively simple, a hollow tube of fired clay with finger holes, but mastering it required months of practice. The melodies you learned were ancient, passed down through generations of priests. They were not meant to be beautiful in any conventional sense. They were meant to be haunting, otherworldly, the voice of the god emanating from your human throat. Your teachers were patient but exacting. Every note had to be perfect. This music would announce your final procession through the city streets. The afternoons brought dance instruction. Aztec ritual dance was nothing like the spontaneous celebration we might imagine. It was precise choreography, every movement laden with symbolic meaning. Your arms had to extend at exact angles. Your feet had to strike the ground in specific rhythms that corresponded to the cosmic order. You danced for hours until your legs trembled and sweat poured down your painted skin. The bells on your ankles created a constant percussion, a metallic shimmer that became the soundtrack of your existence. In time, you could hear those bells in your sleep. But it was the evenings that revealed the full psychological complexity of your situation. As the sun set and turned the sky the color of blood, you were allowed to walk through Tenochtitlan itself. Accompanied by your attendants, you moved through the greatest city in Mesoamerica, a metropolis of perhaps 200,000 people, built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. The causeways stretched away in 3 directions, connecting the island city to the mainland. Canoes glided through the canals, carrying goods from every corner of the empire. The Great Pyramid dominated the ceremonial center, its twin temples rising more than 100 feet into the air, the steps stained dark with the blood of countless previous sacrifices. People stopped what they were doing when you passed. They fell to their knees. They pressed their fingers to the earth and then to their lips, the gesture of reverence. Mothers held up their children so the little ones could receive your blessing. You touched their heads and the mothers wept with gratitude. Old men whispered prayers. Young warriors looked at you with something between awe and envy. For what could be more glorious than to die in service to the gods? The marketplace was a sensory assault. The smell of grilled maize and roasting chilies mingled with the coppery scent of blood from the butcher's stalls. Merchants called out their wares in Nahuatl, the language that flowed like water, full of glottal stops and soft consonants. Mountains of tomatoes and squash, pyramids of avocados, bins of cacao beans that served as currency. Vendors sold brilliant feathers from tropical birds, scarlet, turquoise, emerald green. Others displayed jaguar pelts, obsidian blades so sharp they could split a hair, copper bells that chimed in the breeze. You could have anything you wanted. All of it was yours for the asking, and yet, Every face you saw, every person who bowed before you, was a reminder they were worshiping a dead man. They were praying to a ghost who hadn't yet left his body. You were the most honored and most doomed individual in the entire empire, and everyone knew it. The reverence in their eyes was inseparable from the knowledge of your fate. They weren't just seeing Tezcatlipoca when they looked at you, they were seeing next year's sacrifice, already chosen, already marked, walking among them as a living countdown to cosmic renewal. The Spanish conquistador Bernardino de Sahagún, who arrived in Mexico after the conquest and interviewed countless indigenous informants about Aztec practices, recorded that the Ixiptla went about playing the flute with his flowers and his smoking tube, by day and by night, wherever he wished. But Sahagún also noted the undercurrent of sorrow. If he did not feel like eating or drinking, his attendants forced him. The implication is clear. Some Ixiptla fell into depression, lost their appetite, perhaps even their will to continue the charade. 20 days before the final sacrifice, the transformation deepened. Your head was shaved in the style of a seasoned warrior. You were given 4 wives, or rather, 4 young women, who would serve as living embodiments of 4 goddesses. These were not love matches or even ordinary marriages. They were ritual unions, symbolic and choreographed. The young women had been trained for this role just as you had been trained for yours. For 20 days, you would live with them, performing the outward rituals of marriage while all 5 of you prepared for the end. The sources are delicately vague about the physical intimacy of these final weeks, but the emotional dimension must have been almost unbearable. These young women were not your captors. They were victims of the same system, their futures also determined by forces beyond their control. Did you talk with them in the quiet hours? Did you share your fears? Did they offer comfort, or were they too trapped in their own dread to provide solace? The historical record is silent on these intimate human moments, but we know they existed. Terror and tenderness must have coexisted in those final days. During these 20 days, the rituals intensified. You attended elaborate banquets where the nobility of Tenochtitlan gathered to honor you. You sat at the high table dressed in your finest regalia, while nobles who commanded armies and controlled vast territories served you food with their own hands. They gave speeches praising your courage and your sacred role. They toasted you with pulque, the fermented agave drink that blurred the edges of consciousness. And through it all, you knew, everyone in that room knew, that these were funeral rites disguised as celebrations. This was an extended wake for someone who was still breathing. The city itself seemed to pulse with anticipation as your final day approached. Additional sacrifices were planned to coincide with yours, prisoners of war who would die in the more common, less elaborately ritualized manner. The priests began their own preparations, fasting and performing penances, sharpening the obsidian blades that would be used on the pyramid. The entire empire operated on a calendar of ritual obligations, and Toxcatl, the festival during which your sacrifice would occur, was one of the most important points in the sacred year. Your death was not just a religious act, it was a cosmic necessity, the pivot point on which the universe itself turned. On the final day, you woke to the sound of drums. The deep resonating boom of the Ixiptla, the great war drum made from a hollowed tree trunk and covered with jaguar skin, echoed across the city. It was still dark, the hour before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day. Your attendants bathed you one last time, dressed you in fresh regalia, painted your skin with fresh black pigment. You were given a final meal, though whether you could eat it is another question lost to history. The procession began as the sun broke over the eastern mountains. You walked through the streets of Tenochtitlan for the last time, playing your clay flute. The melody was the one you'd practiced for a year, and now it flowed from your fingers with unconscious precision. Behind you came your 4 ritual wives, weeping, Behind them came the priests in their black robes, their hair matted with the dried blood of previous sacrifices, the smell of death clinging to them like a second skin. Behind them came nobles, warriors, and a crowd of thousands who lined the streets and rooftops. The route took you along the main causeway and then back toward the ceremonial center. At certain predetermined points, you stopped and broke one of your flutes. This was rich in symbolism. The breaking of the flute represented the breaking of your earthly attachments, the severing of your mortal identity. By the time you reached the base of the Great Pyramid, all your flutes were destroyed. You had nothing left of the instruments that had defined your year as a living god. The pyramid stairs stretched upward at a steep angle, 114 steps to the top. You began to climb. Your legs, weakened perhaps by fasting or by the sheer weight of terror, carried you upward. With each step, the city spread out below you in expanding panorama. You could see the entire island, the causeways, the lake stretching to the horizon, the mountains beyond. You could see the floating gardens where crops grew in the shallow waters. You could see the entire Aztec world, the empire that demanded your death to sustain itself. At the top of the pyramid, 4 priests waited. When you reached the summit, they seized you, one for each limb. They bent you backward over the tech cattle, the sacrificial stone, arching your chest upward and pulling your arms and legs taut. Your head hung back, your vision inverted, the sky where the earth should be. Another priest, the high priest who would perform the actual sacrifice, approached with the obsidian blade. The Spanish accounts describe what happened next with clinical horror. The priest made a swift, diagonal cut beneath your ribcage. The obsidian blade, sharper than any steel, sliced through skin and muscle. The priest's hand plunged into the wound and grasped your heart. With a practiced twist, these priests performed this operation repeatedly, perfecting their technique. He severed the arteries and pulled your heart from your chest while it was still beating. He held it aloft, offering it to the sun. Blood poured down his arms. Your heart continued to pulse in his hands for several seconds before finally stopping. But here's what the dramatic retellings often miss. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't frenzied violence. This was the culmination of a year-long theatrical production orchestrated by the most sophisticated bureaucratic state in pre-Columbian America. Every element, your selection, your year of luxury, your training, your procession, your death, was a calculated piece of political theater designed to achieve specific goals. The Aztec Empire was not held together primarily by military might, though it certainly had powerful armies. It was held together by ideology, by a shared cosmic vision that made the empire's existence seem not just inevitable, but necessary for the survival of the universe itself. The sun needed blood to rise each day, the rains needed blood to fall, the crops needed blood to grow. The entire cosmic order depended on a continuous flow of human sacrifice, and the state was the only institution capable of providing it. The Ixiptla sacrifice was the pinnacle of this ideology. By transforming a human being into a god and then publicly killing that god, the Aztec state demonstrated its ultimate power, power over life and death, power over the divine itself, power to literally recreate the cosmos through ritual violence. Every person who witnessed your death, and thousands did, was receiving a message. This is what the empire can do. This is the power we wield. This is what we are willing to do to maintain cosmic order. It was spectacular violence as social control. The year of luxury you experienced wasn't mercy or kindness. It was amplification. By elevating you to the highest possible position before your death, the state made your sacrifice even more powerful as a demonstration of its absolute authority. If even a living god could be killed on schedule, what chance did any ordinary person have of resisting the state's will? After your heart was removed, your body was thrown down the pyramid steps. It tumbled and broke on the way down, finally coming to rest at the base where other priests waited. Your body was dismembered, according to ritual protocol. Parts were distributed to nobles who had sponsored your year of luxury. Some sources suggest that in certain circumstances, ritual cannibalism occurred, not from hunger, but as a sacred act of consuming the divine. Your skull was stripped of flesh and added to the Tzompantli, the great rack of skulls that stood near the pyramid, a monument to all those who had fed the gods. Your 4 ritual wives had their heads shaved and returned to their families, forever marked by their 20-day marriage to a god. Your own family received honors and material support. The empire had taken you from them, but it compensated them according to its own logic, a logic that valued cosmic order above individual human life. We can't know what you felt in your final moments. Did the year of ritual and reverence create a genuine belief that you were divine, making your death feel like apotheosis rather than murder? Did the psychoactive substances some scholars believe were administered create a dissociative state that muted the terror? Or were you, in the end, simply a terrified young person dying a brutal death while thousands watched? What we do know is that this practice wasn't an aberration or a sign of primitive savagery, as Spanish conquistadors claimed to justify their own violence. It was the logical expression of a sophisticated civilization's deepest beliefs about the nature of reality, power, and the relationship between humans and the cosmos. The Aztecs genuinely believed the universe would collapse without these sacrifices. They believed they were preventing apocalypse, but belief alone doesn't explain the elaborate spectacle, the year-long preparation, the public performance of death. Those elements reveal the political infrastructure beneath the religious facade. The Aztec state needed its subjects to be awestruck, to be terrified, to be absolutely convinced of the state's necessity and power. The Ixiptla sacrifice accomplished all of this with elegant efficiency. When we look at the Aztec practice of human sacrifice today, we're tempted to see it as something alien, something that marks the Aztecs as fundamentally different from us. But perhaps the more unsettling truth is how familiar it is. The use of spectacular violence to maintain political power, the transformation of individuals into symbols to serve state purposes, the willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable to preserve the existing order, these patterns persist across human history and into our own time. The methods change, the scale varies, but the underlying logic remains disturbingly recognizable. You were not a god, you were a person, someone with hopes and fears, with a family who loved you, with a future that was stolen and transformed into theater. The Aztec Empire wrote you into its grand narrative of cosmic necessity, but that narrative was always a story told by the powerful to justify their power. Your death was not necessary to make the sun rise. It was necessary to make an empire function, and that difference matters.